The morning sky over the Pacific looked calm, but anyone who had flown these routes knew better. High above New Guinea in 1943, a lone Allied B-25 Mitchell bomber pushed on through the haze, one engine coughing out a long trail of black smoke. The aircraft was wounded, barely holding its altitude. Inside, the crew exchanged quiet glances. They all understood what usually came next. 6 Japanese Zero fighters drifted into view, circling like hawks above a dying animal. The bomber crew braced for the final attack, expecting the kill shot at any second. But the pilot at the controls, J.Zaemer Jr., did something completely unexpected, something no manual had ever suggested. He eased the throttle back instead of pushing it forward. The aircraft slowed dangerously, almost to the edge of a stall. The Japanese fighters, committed to their attack speed, overshot. Their formation scattered. Confusion broke out in the enemy ranks. And that brief moment changed everything. What followed would later be dissected in flight schools and military academies, studied not as an act of desperation, but as an example of pure, calculated defiance. New Guinea, during this stage of the war, was unforgiving. The 5th Air Force operated under General George Kenney, flying long, exhausting missions across open ocean with almost no margin for error. If your engines quit, you ditched. If you ditched, you vanished. The humid air inside the cockpit felt like breathing through wet cloth. Sweat rolled down faces, pooling in the collar of flight suits. Gunpowder, fuel fumes, and the metallic tang of burning hydraulic lines lingered everywhere. The Japanese controlled sections of the sky with their famed Zero fighters, light, agile, and flown by pilots who had been training since boyhood. American bomber crews were paying a steep price. Losses were so frequent that intelligence officers dreaded updating the statistics board. For every mission that succeeded, another ended in tragedy. New crews arrived constantly, young, untested, and too often gone after their first sortie. Into this brutal environment stepped a pilot who did not look like the stereotype of a wartime hero. J.Zaemer Jr., tall and thin with wire-rimmed glasses, spoke slowly, choosing his words like a man assembling a bridge. He studied manuals, diagrams, and enemy tactics obsessively. While others played poker or wrote letters home, Zeamer sat with reports and strategy charts, scribbling notes in the margins. Some mocked him, calling him the Bookworm. Others dismissed him entirely. Yet the battlefield has a way of revealing what truly matters. Not swagger, not talk, but clarity under pressure. And on this day, with the sky turning into a killing ground, Zeamer's clarity would be the only reason his crew had a fighting chance.
Before the world knew his name, J.Zaemer Jr. was the type of pilot commanders didn't know what to do with. He didn't fit the classic image of a fighter ace or a brash bomber leader. He wasn't loud, wasn't aggressive, and never tried to impress anyone. Instead, he watched, listened, and analyzed, qualities that made him valuable but also hard to place in a system built on instinct and swagger. Zeamer's appearance alone made him stand out. Tall and narrow-framed, wearing round glasses that fogged in the New Guinea humidity, he looked more like an engineer heading to a laboratory than a pilot heading into combat. And in many ways, that was exactly who he was. A proud graduate of MIT, he understood the world through the lens of numbers and physics. Every movement in the sky, every turn, every burst of speed, he saw it all as problems to be solved. He asked questions that annoyed his superiors. Why follow enemy fighters into their turning radius? Why stick to patterns the Japanese already expect? What if we survive by changing the equation instead of trying to match theirs? These were not typical pilot questions. They were the questions of a man who saw war as a system of variables, not as a place for heroics. To the brass, he felt unpredictable. To some pilots, he felt unsafe. But a few quiet observers noticed something different. Zeamer wasn't reckless, he was deliberate. He didn't chase glory, he chased understanding. His early assignments reflected the uncertainty surrounding him. He was shuffled from one squadron to another, filling in for sick pilots, flying co-pilot positions, logging hours but never receiving his own permanent crew. It was a subtle exile, the kind nobody talked about openly. You weren't bad, you just weren't the kind of officer they wanted leading missions. But over time, something unexpected happened. Zeamer began volunteering for missions everyone else avoided: long solo reconnaissance flights, photo mapping runs with no escort, deep penetrations into enemy territory with outdated planes. These missions required precision, not prestige. They needed someone who could stay calm, think clearly, and calculate survival down to the last drop of fuel, and that was exactly what Zeamer brought to the table. Slowly, misfit crewmen gravitated toward him: gunners who had been reprimanded, navigators who had survived crashes, bombardiers overlooked for promotion. They didn't care if Zeamer wasn't flashy, they trusted him because he never wasted their lives on bravado. He took an old B-25 that had been written off twice and modified it like an engineer restoring a broken machine. More guns, stronger mounts, extra armor, reinforced windows. He ran fuel estimates like a mathematician. Nothing about him was inspirational, but everything was precise. And in a world where chaos ruled the sky, precision could mean survival.
By mid-1943, J.Zaemer Jr. had quietly built a crew of men who were just like him, overlooked, underestimated, or written off as misfits. But together, something extraordinary took shape. They didn't fly for medals. They didn't fly for glory. They flew because they trusted one another's competence more than anything else in the world. Their aircraft, an old B-25 that had seen better days, became a symbol of their identity. It rattled, groaned, and leaked hydraulic fluid, but under Zeamer's watch, it was transformed into something unique: a bomber with the heart of a gunship. He added firepower wherever he could fit it: forward-facing cannons, reinforced side turrets, strengthened tail positions. It looked ugly, patched together with aluminum and tape, but it was lethal. Zeamer briefed his crew differently than other pilots. He didn't give emotional speeches or wave mission flags. Instead, he delivered clear numbers, calm probabilities, and precise plans. Fuel burn gives us 17 minutes over target. If we take a hit here, we divert east. If an engine dies, glide ratio takes us to these coordinates. Simple, calculated, predictable, until it needed to be unpredictable. Then came the day when Command announced a reconnaissance mission to Bougainville, deep in Japanese-controlled territory. The job was simple in words, but deadly in practice. Photograph enemy airfields, shipping lanes, and installations. Fly hundreds of miles with no escort. Expect heavy fighter resistance. Return if you can. The mission brief wasn't just labeled dangerous, it was marked voluntary. In military terms, that meant everyone expected the assigned crew would not come back. When the call went out, silence filled the room. No one stepped forward, no one even breathed loudly. Then, without hesitation, Zeamer said, "I'll take it." His crew didn't look surprised. They had flown enough missions with him to know he didn't make impulsive decisions. If Zeamer accepted, he had already run the math in his head. He already knew the risks and the odds. One by one, every man on his crew agreed to go with him. They didn't follow him because he was fearless. They followed because he was prepared, because he never lied to them about danger, because if anyone could guide them through a mission like this, it was the quiet engineer with wire-rimmed glasses who treated survival like an equation he refused to solve incorrectly. On June 16, 1943, before dawn, the misfit crew climbed into their battered bomber. Their journey toward Bougainville, the flight that would redefine their lives and aviation history, was about to begin. And none of them expected to return.
June 16, 1943. Before sunrise, the airfield at Dabadora was silent, except for the buzzing insects and the soft clatter of tools from the ground crew. The mission was so dangerous that no one bothered pretending otherwise. The men, tightening bolts and patching bullet holes, worked quietly, each of them aware that this aircraft might not return. Zeamer walked a full circle around the B-25, running his hand along the patched aluminum skins and reinforced gun mounts. To anyone else, the plane looked exhausted, too scarred to trust, too beaten to fly. But to J.Zaemer Jr., it was a carefully prepared machine, modified with intent, calculated for survival. He reviewed fuel numbers with his navigator, double-checked the cannon mounts, then gathered the crew. His briefing was as emotionless as ever. 17 minutes over target. If we take heavy fire, we break east. If we lose an engine, glide to Point Charlie. No speeches, no dramatic declarations, just data. At 4 a.m., the bomber roared down the runway. The darkness swallowed them whole. They flew low over the black ocean, avoiding radar, engines humming steadily. No radio chatter, no escort. Just the heavy, rhythmic thump of propellers cutting through the humid air. By 6 a.m., the eastern horizon glowed orange. The sea below turned from black to silver as dawn spread across Bougainville. Zeamer climbed to photo altitude. The bombardier positioned himself over the cameras, adjusting focus, waiting for the target. Below them, Japanese installations came into view. Fuel depots, supply barges, camouflaged huts, airstrips carved into the coastline. Everything the 5th Air Force needed to understand before launching future assaults. Every frame of film would save American lives, if they survived long enough to bring the photos home. The bombardier began taking pictures. Zeamer kept the bomber steady, perfectly level, ignoring the tension rising in the cabin. Every man knew this was the most vulnerable moment of the mission. Then came the alert. "Bandits! 6 fighters, closing fast!" The rear gunner's voice cut through the cockpit like a blade. 6 Mitsubishi Zeros, the most feared fighters in the Pacific, climbed up toward them in a precise attack pattern. They didn't dive in immediately. They circled, studied, and waited for the bomber to finish its photo run. It was a hunter's patience. Zeamer didn't flinch. 45 seconds more, he said calmly. The crew held their breath. Cameras clicked. The Zeros tightened their circle. When the photo run was complete, Zeamer banked east and pushed the throttle forward. The mission was done. Now came the deadly part, staying alive. The sky around them darkened with incoming fighters. The battle was about to begin. As the bomber turned east, the calm calculations that had guided the mission shifted into the raw urgency of survival. 6 Japanese Zeros fanned out behind J.Zaemer Jr.'s B-25, closing in with surgical precision. These weren't random interceptors. This was a coordinated hunter team, trained to dismantle bombers one piece at a time. The first burst came without warning. Cannon shells slammed into the tail section, ripping through aluminum skin and hydraulic lines. Warning lights flashed across the cockpit. The rear gunner shouted over the intercom, "We're hit! Heavy damage!" But his voice carried no panic. This crew had already accepted long before takeoff that fear was a useless passenger. Zeamer kept the aircraft level, eyes scanning the formation behind him. He watched the spacing, the attack angles, the rhythm of the Zero pilots. It was a lethal dance, one the Japanese had performed hundreds of times. The second Zero dove from high above, lining up the perfect shot. Every manual said the same thing: keep speed, maintain formation, run for distance. But Zeamer wasn't thinking about manuals. He was thinking about energy states, closing velocities, and the moment when an attacker commits to an irreversible trajectory. "Hold steady," he said quietly. The crew braced. The Zero closed to 400 yards, then 300, then 250. At the last possible moment, when every instinct screamed to accelerate, Zeamer pulled the throttle back, hard. The bomber shuddered violently, as if it had hit a wall of air. The sudden deceleration caught the Zero pilot completely off guard. Traveling too fast to adjust, the Japanese fighter shot past the bomber, overshooting the target by a wide margin. "Now," Zeamer shouted. The top gunner opened up with a full burst. Tracers arced into the sky, slicing across the Zero's fuselage. Flames erupted from its engine as it spiraled downward, trailing smoke all the way to the sea. The crew roared in disbelief. No bomber slowed down under attack, but Zeamer had done what every instructor swore was suicidal, and it had worked. But there was no time to celebrate. The other Zeros hesitated for only a moment before regrouping. Their confusion turned to aggression. They broke formation, approaching from new angles, above, below, and the blind spot behind the waist guns. Zeamer watched their movements, each one a variable in his mental map. "Brace again," he warned. "They're adapting." The second attack was seconds away. But Zeamer wasn't.
As the bomber turned east, the calm calculations that had guided the mission shifted into the raw urgency of survival. 6 Japanese Zeros fanned out behind j.Zaemer Jr.'s B-25, closing in with surgical precision. These weren't random interceptors. This was a coordinated hunter team, trained to dismantle bombers one piece at a time. The first burst came without warning. Cannon shells slammed into the tail section, ripping through aluminum skin and hydraulic lines. Warning lights flashed across the cockpit. The rear gunner shouted over the intercom, "We're hit! Heavy damage!" But his voice carried no panic. This crew had already accepted long before takeoff that fear was a useless passenger. Zeamer kept the aircraft level, eyes scanning the formation behind him. He watched the spacing, the attack angles, the rhythm of the Zero pilots. It was a lethal dance, one the Japanese had performed hundreds of times. The second Zero dove from high above, lining up the perfect shot. Every manual said the same thing: keep speed, maintain formation, run for distance. But Zeamer wasn't thinking about manuals. He was thinking about energy states, closing velocities, and the moment when an attacker commits to an irreversible trajectory. "Hold steady," he said quietly. The crew braced. The Zero closed to 400 yards, then 300, then 250. At the last possible moment, when every instinct screamed to accelerate, Zeamer pulled the throttle back, hard. The bomber shuddered violently, as if it had hit a wall of air. The sudden deceleration caught the Zero pilot completely off guard. Traveling too fast to adjust, the Japanese fighter shot past the bomber, overshooting the target by a wide margin. "Now!" Zeamer shouted. The top gunner opened up with a full burst. Tracers arced into the sky, slicing across the Zero's fuselage. Flames erupted from its engine as it spiraled downward, trailing smoke all the way to the sea. The crew roared in disbelief. No bomber slowed down under attack, but Zeamer had done what every instructor swore was suicidal, and it had worked. But there was no time to celebrate. The other Zeros hesitated for only a moment before regrouping. Their confusion turned to aggression. They broke formation, approaching from new angles, above, below, and the blind spot behind the waist guns. Zeamer watched their movements, each one a variable in his mental map. "Brace again," he warned. "They're adapting." The second attack was seconds away, but Zeamer wasn't done rewriting the rules.
The dogfight over Bougainville had transformed into a brutal test of endurance. What began as a routine interception for the Japanese had turned into a baffling standoff. Instead of collapsing under pressure, j.Zaemer Jr. and his misfit crew were fighting back with a strange, unpredictable rhythm the enemy couldn't anticipate. But even with 2 Zeros driven off, the remaining fighters were still deadly, and they were getting angrier. The next attack came from above. A Zero dropped down like a stone, guns spitting fire. Bullets shattered the top turret's glass, spraying fragments across the gunner's face. He wiped the blood from his eyes and kept shooting. Another burst ripped through the cockpit side panel, slicing across Zeamer's arm. His flight suit soaked quickly, but his grip on the controls didn't falter. "Pilot hit!" the bombardier shouted. "I'm fine," Zeamer replied, voice steady despite the pain. "Watch your sectors." A fresh wave of cannon shells hammered the fuselage.
The entire aircraft vibrated violently. One engine sputtered, coughing smoke. The tail section groaned under the stress of repeated impacts, threatening to tear loose. In the back of the bomber, hydraulic fluid sprayed like mist, coating the gunner's hands and faces. Yet, the crew never stopped firing. The B-25's extra guns, installed by Zeamer himself, now became the only reason the crew was still alive. Forward cannons answered the Japanese climbs. Waist guns shredded incoming passes. The tail gunner, covered in smoke and oil, tracked a Zero with exhausted determination. "I've got him! Got him! Firing!" His burst struck true. Another Zero veered away, trailing smoke, disappearing behind a bank of clouds. 3 attackers remained. But the bomber was taking damage faster than it could endure. One hydraulic line burst completely, causing the left landing gear to drop halfway like a broken kneecap. Every few seconds brought a new hole, a new warning light, a new leak. Inside the cockpit, the oxygen system failed, fogging the glass. The smell of burning rubber and cordite flooded the air. Zeamer squinted through the haze, fighting to keep the aircraft level. Blood ran down his leg, shrapnel was embedded in his shoulder, but his voice remained eerily calm. "They're trying to force us into a stall. Don't let them," he warned. "How are you still flying this thing?" the navigator shouted. Zeamer didn't answer. He didn't need to. The bomber dipped suddenly as another Zero made a pass, but Zeamer countered with a last-second throttle surge, throwing the attacker off balance. The gunners took advantage, riddling its wing with lead. 4 attackers crippled or driven off. 2 still circling. But fuel was burning fast, and the battered B-25 was running out of sky, power, and luck. The fight wasn't over, but the final strike
The air above
was
Bougainville
coming.
had become a swirling storm of smoke, tracers, and torn metal. The B-25 was still flying, but just barely. One engine sputtered in protest with every revolution. The hydraulics were nearly gone, and the bomber looked more like a floating wreck than a combat aircraft. Yet somehow, j.zaemer Jr. kept it steady enough for his gunners to fight. 2 Zeros remained in the sky, experienced pilots who had watched 4 of their comrades fall away. They stopped rushing in. They began circling, calculating, waiting for the bomber to expose a weakness it could no longer hide. Inside the chaos of the cockpit, Zeamer shifted his weight, trying to keep pressure off the wounds in his shoulder and leg. Every breath stung. Every movement sent a jolt of pain down his side, but his voice stayed level, controlled, almost cold. "They're lining up a high pass. Tail, prepare for a dive attack." The tail gunner adjusted, wiping oil from his goggles. His hands trembled, but not from fear, just exhaustion. A Zero swooped in from above, angling toward the bomber's crippled left side. Its cannon flashed, ripping another line of holes into the fuselage. The B-25 lurched hard. A burst of smoke filled the cockpit, making the crew cough violently. For a moment, it felt like the aircraft might fall apart in midair. "Compensating," Zeamer muttered, reducing throttle on the good engine, pushing rudder to counter the drag. The bomber steadied itself just long enough for the top gunner to track the Zero. "Clear shot! Firing!" His rounds connected, peppering the Zero's fuselage. The fighter pulled up sharply, trailing smoke. Not a kill, but enough to break the pilot's nerve. He disengaged, disappearing behind a wall of clouds. Only 1 Zero remained. The last fighters circled slowly, studying the bomber like a predator deciding where to bite. Fuel smoke poured from the B-25. The landing gear dangled uselessly. Half the tail looked flayed. It was clearly dying. But the Zero pilot hesitated. This was no ordinary bomber. It had fought like a cornered animal, and every approach so far had been met with unexpected movement and disciplined volleys of fire. The B-25 no longer looked dangerous, but it still felt dangerous. "Pilot, he's moving in again," the navigator warned. "Let him come," Zeamer said quietly. The Zero committed to one final attack run, diving from the sun to blind the gunners. Zeamer waited, counting silently. 1, 2. Now! He pulled throttle back sharply and dipped the nose just a fraction. The maneuver threw off the Zero's angle of approach, forcing it to overshoot by a thin margin. The waist gunner seized the moment. A long burst of .50 caliber fire stitched across the Zero's tail and wing. Smoke erupted from the engine. The fighter wobbled, climbed weakly, then peeled off toward the sea. It didn't return. For the first time since the battle had begun, the skies around them were quiet. But survival was still far from guaranteed. The bomber was barely holding together, and they were hundreds of miles from home.
Silence returned to the sky, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that follows chaos, the quiet after an explosion, when the ringing in your ears is louder than the world outside. The 6 Japanese fighters were gone, either destroyed, damaged, or forced to break off. But the victory felt hollow. The B-25 was dying. Inside the cockpit, smoke drifted in thin, ghost-like streams. The oxygen system was shot. The left hydraulic line was gone. One engine knocked rhythmically like a hammer inside a metal drum. The control yoke felt heavy and unresponsive, as if the aircraft were resisting Zeamer's every command. The navigator leaned forward, breathing hard. "We need to head home, now." "We are," Zeamer replied, though his voice trembled slightly for the first time. His face was pale, blood soaked through his flight suit dripping onto the floor. His legs were numb, his shoulders stiff, but his eyes remained focused on the horizon. The crew checked on each other. Nearly everyone was wounded. Cuts, burns, shrapnel embedded under skin. The bombardier had been hit twice in the legs. A gunner's arm dangled uselessly. Yet not one man suggested bailing out, even though every one of them knew the plane might not stay airborne. The return flight was a battle of attrition. The bomber lost altitude inch by inch. Zeamer compensated with calculated adjustments, nursing the failing engine through gentle throttle changes. Every time the propeller sputtered, the crew held their breath. "Pilot, we're drifting south," the navigator warned. "I know," Zeamer whispered. "Crosswinds. Adjusting now." He corrected with slow rudder inputs. Blood ran from his fingertips onto the throttle lever. But he didn't stop flying. Hours felt like days. Finally, the green expanse of Allied-controlled New Guinea appeared through the haze. Relief washed through the cabin. But only for a moment. A new problem emerged. The landing gear was stuck, halfway down. The hydraulic system was too badly damaged to lower it fully. The crew tried manual release. Nothing. They kicked the panels. Nothing. The wheels hung uselessly like broken limbs. "We're coming in on one engine with half a gear," the co-pilot muttered, shaking his head. "We'll manage," Zeamer said, through clenched teeth. He lined up for the runway. The bomber drifted, struggling to maintain direction. The working engine growled, barely hanging on. The wounded plane descended unevenly, scraping the tropical winds. "Brace!" Zeamer shouted. The aircraft slammed into the runway, skidding violently, sparks erupting from the exposed metal. The bomber tore across the field, plunging into the muddy grass at the edge of the strip before finally grinding to a halt. For a moment, no one moved. Then the hatch opened. The crew, bloodied, shaking, alive, stumbled out into the daylight. Ground crews rushed over, stopping dead when they saw the state of the bomber. The fuselage looked like it had flown through a sawmill. More than 500 bullet holes, shredded tail, cracked canopy. The impossible had happened. They had come home.
Medics rushed toward the battered crew as they staggered out of the wrecked B-25. Some collapsed immediately. Others stayed standing through sheer force of will. J.Zaemer Jr., pale and bleeding heavily, insisted the others be treated first. Only when he nearly fainted did the medics force him onto a stretcher. Inside the medical tent, the scene grew even more surreal. Shrapnel was pulled from legs, arms, and shoulders. bandages wrapped around wounds that had nearly bled out during flight. Through it all, Zeamer's expression remained calm, almost detached, as if analyzing damage to a machine rather than his own body. A senior officer arrived soon after, demanding to know what had happened. How had a single bomber fought off 6 elite Japanese fighters? How had a mission labeled suicidal ended with everyone still alive? Zeamer explained everything with the same engineer-like clarity he always carried. The deliberate throttle cuts, the precise timing, the energy calculations, the unpredictable adjustments that disrupted enemy attack patterns. He didn't brag, he didn't dramatize, he simply described the logic. The officer listened quietly. By the end of the debriefing, the tent had fallen silent. The tactics Zeamer used were unheard of, dangerous, unorthodox, bordering on insubordination. No pilot was trained to slow down under fire. But Zeamer had studied physics where others studied instinct. He used calculation where others used speed. And he had survived. 3 days later, the answer arrived. J.Zaemer Jr. was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest American military decoration. His bombardier received one as well. The rest of the crew earned Distinguished Service Crosses. Their citations were dry, official, and understated, but the truth behind them spread through every squadron like wildfire. Pilots began explaining with variations of Zeamer's throttle technique. Instructors discussed energy management in hushed tones during advanced training. Flight manuals didn't change, but pilot culture did. The lesson was simple. Unpredictability is a weapon. Timing beats brute force. A bomber doesn't have to outrun a fighter. It just has to break the fighter's expectations. Zeamer's combat injuries were too severe for him to fly frontline missions again. He spent the remainder of the war training pilots, teaching them to think instead of react, to understand airflow and momentum instead of relying on reflex alone. After the war, he returned to quiet civilian life. He worked as an engineer. He married, raised a family, designed bridges and water systems, and stayed far from the spotlight. He rarely talked about what he had done, and when he did, it was only if someone asked directly. He passed away in 2007 at the age of 88. His obituary mentioned MIT. It mentioned the Medal of Honor. It didn't mention the throttle trick, because it was never officially recorded. But pilots knew. In flight schools decades later, instructors still emphasized concepts he embraced instinctively: energy balance, timing, and the power of unpredictable movement. Young aviators learned that sometimes the smartest move in the sky is the one no one expects. J.Zaemer Jr. didn't change the war alone, but he changed the way pilots thought. He proved that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, analytical, and covered in engine grease. His plane is gone. His name fades with time. But the idea he proved in the skies over Bougainville endures. In war and in life, the smartest move isn't always the fastest one. Sometimes it's the one that defies every rule.